gospel reading we've just heard from Luke seems to be in opposition from some other things that we have heard about Jesus. Specifically, we know that even in the advent of his birth, that the angels come and say to the shepherds, the peace has come. The Prince of Peace is one of the titles that we have for Christ. And we know that we've heard Christ say things like, "My peace I give you, my peace be with you." And yet now this time, we hear something that instead of us passing the peace at each Sunday service, we hear something today that says, "You think I've come to bring you peace? I have come to set you on fire." It's kind of basically what we're hearing. I have come in such a way that it's going to cause division. So this, what seems like an opposition, is something to take another look at, because it means whenever we see those oppositional messages, it means that it's something very important to look at here, something deeper under what we're hearing. The first is to remember a context in the Gospel of Luke, who's been telling a story over the past several Sundays from Luke. At this point, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. They're literally walking to his death. And he is in anticipation, in full awareness of the things he's going to do and what he's going to say is going to cause him to be the target of people's prejudices and hatreds, of people's willingness to basically sacrifice him for what they think is important to them. And he's trying to teach his apostles his very last messages, his very last teachings. Time is getting short. He has only a little while to be with them, and so his energy in Luke's gospel gets very intense from this point forward. He is a man with great urgency in what he is saying. And so far, they've been pretty sublime with it. They haven't liked everything, but they haven't really gotten jazzed by a whole lot. What is clear is that Jesus' message is in the context of facing empire, of challenging empire, of oppression and subjugation, and injustice in the Roman occupation of Judah and Israel and Palestine. Now, when we hear all of this, I am reminded of a couple of years back when there was an action going on at Standing Rock in North Dakota, and some of you may remember how there was a pipeline that was being put in place, and the Lakota people were protesting that, in part because it was going across sovereign tribal lands without tribal permission, but also because where they were laying down the pipeline was specifically going through sensitive historical sites of ancient ritual and burials. Particular parts of the land where they were camped out, where security forces had come to support the oil company's claim and the building of the pipeline, they had encamped themselves specifically on those most sensitive areas of ancient burials and ritual. And that, all of that together, became a point at which the Native people said we must stand against it. And they stood in a way that was very profound. It was a way that was dedicated to being peaceful, to being grounded in their belief system of balance, of wanting to be what you might think of as warriors or healers of peace. Not warriors that do damage, but warriors that are bound to care for the whole community and to care for relationships. So the Reverend John Floberg, who's Episcopal Church at Cannonball in North Dakota, very close to that community, made a call to Episcopal clergy with the hope that he could gather about 100 of us to do a special action. And he had permission of the elders that were at the camp at Standing Rock to do this. Well, over 300 clergy responded, and not just Episcopalians. There were Buddhists and Jewish leaders, and you can name it. they were there, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians. And we all came together for this action. And what we did is, when we came onto the site, we had a prayer service around the Elders' Fire Circle. And part of that service was reading the Episcopal Church's formal apology to Native Americans for the Church's role in their subjugation and in taking away their traditions and their lands. That apology, you can find it online if you look it up under the Jamestown Covenant. And that Jamestown Covenant apology, it was read, and then in the prayers we were blessed and smudged by the elders with sacred smoke. And then we walked up onto the road to where there was this barrier, and the security forces representing the oil company were on the other side. So something to know in contrast to this community I've just described is that this community of security people that were there, who were paid for by the oil company to be there, who were police officers from all over the nation, who had been paid $325,000 just to be there for this encampment. So money that they had never seen before was part of the draw by a company and people of privilege who could afford that, whose resources were apparently limitless. Because even though the oil company was camped illegally on sacred ground, sovereign ground, they were willing to pay $100,000 every day in fines because they knew that they had not filed the correct paperwork and gone through the correct process, because they thought that they would be declined or delayed in building the pipeline. They were encamped there in armored vehicles with full body armor and masks and full live ammunition, as well as rubber bullets, as well as tear gas. So they were on the other side of the barrier while we had our ritual and sang our songs and said our speeches, and then went back to camp. I stayed in camp that night, and the next morning I was awoken to the sound of a young Lakota man on a horse who was running through camp saying, "Come quickly and help, come help, come help. They're doing horrible things, please come help." And I responded with some medics to the scene on the riverbank. To set this scene, it's flat on the side of the Lakota. There's a very small bank on the other side with kind of a cliff. And at the top of that embankment was that very sensitive tribal site for ancient burial and ritual. And the young Lakota people had overnight built just a bridge out of whatever they could find that could float, because they wanted to go over to talk to the security people who continued to decline to have a conversation. What the Lakota wanted was simply for them to move away off of that most sacred, sensitive site and closer to the road. They weren't telling them to go, they weren't throwing anything at them, they weren't threatening them. They were asking to talk, and could we just move off there? Well, the security forces used rappelling lines to come down the cliff to the bank on the other side. And they met the Lakota young people who were coming across the river, and the security boat came into the river mouth and deconstructed that bridge. And the Lakota young people continued to go try to swim into this cold water of the river to talk to them on the other side. And I will never in my life forget the sight of young Lakota men and women in the water, freezing, right at the edge of the other side of the bank. And as they were saying, "Please talk to us, please just talk to us," they were met by these people in full body armor, holding the largest cans of tear gas that looked like fire extinguishers at point-blank range in their face. There was so much tear gas that ran down their faces and bodies like milk. And they just kept saying, "You're our brothers. Can't you just talk to us? All we want to do is talk to you." And they were met with rubber bullets and more tear gas. Now, there was a moment there where I realized that part of what was so horrific for me and caused me great fear was that even though I was a child of the late 60s and 70s, and kind of thought I knew what protests were like and maybe the dangers that protesters would encounter or how they would be treated, I thought I knew that. But what I didn't realize until that moment was that I had also been raised to think and believe that police and army personnel were operating in my best interest to protect me. I'd always been raised to believe that they were operating in the interests of people. And so to see these actions and to see how justified they felt they were in doing them was a terrible, terrible moment. But my friends, it is a moment that our minority brothers and sisters know too well in this country. It's a moment that we need to hear their stories that they still encounter on a daily basis. It is also something that is still happening. Just this past Thursday, when a group of Jewish protesters were peacefully sitting outside an ICE detention center in Rhode Island, as they were sitting there blocking the entry to that detention center, a security guard from the detention center in an armored truck drove into them, injuring children, a person in a wheelchair, mothers and fathers, just drove into them. As they sat there with signs that said things like, "Never again." Because our Jewish brothers and sisters have spiritual ancestors and a legacy that tells them what happens when it becomes okay to treat people less than human. And informed by their spiritual ancestors and that legacy, they have the courage and the spiritual will to sit in that line while that truck drove into them. We heard in Paul's wonderful letter to the Hebrew community about our legacy of spiritual survivors, our warriors of the past, who were warriors in God's love, and for the ideal of a greater peace, not just for the elite few, but for all people. Who, as Paul illustrates, is almost like walking down a Rhodes gallery of statues and paintings of those courageous people of our Christian and Judeo-Christian legacy. And he's inspiring in that point in time. He's writing to an early fledgling Christian community that is experiencing that same kind of oppression from all sides. From all sides. In competition with an empire that does not want them to exist, that thinks they're an anathema, in competition to other belief systems at the time, who were genuinely afraid that these crazy new Christians and their pioneering founder were absolutely going to get them all killed, that they were putting communities at risk. But they continued to put themselves on the line because they followed a man who was doing exactly that. That journey to Jerusalem that Jesus is on in the Gospel of Luke, when he says this line that really jumps out at me, "I am yet to be baptized by a baptism of fire." There is a baptism in which he is going to. A fire he wishes were already lit among the people, or perhaps this wouldn't happen the way it did. But he goes on that journey knowing how it would end for him. And that is the journey that we are asked to be on. We read in Jeremiah about false prophets, prophecies made in the name of God by people who have aligned themselves with the elites of government, by people who have said things, I promise, or we should do this, or this dictator is our Messiah. And we are reminded by Jeremiah that the cost of discipleship is higher than simply doing nothing. We know that the cost of discipleship in European and American history is that we cannot do nothing. But how we do it, how we walk forward as people of faith, says everything and should say all things to all people about our commitment to love all people, about our commitment to love that comes from a God who loves about our commitment to always say, as our founder said, through word and action and deed, that the rule of empire cannot rule our hearts or the kingdom of God that we are called to create. Our actions must be actions of love for one another, to achieve that greater justice that we seek. Because our vision must be truly based in God. It must reflect a man who gave his own life and put himself on the line. Our discipleship is one in which we must be inspired to that baptism of fire. It doesn't mean we won't be afraid. It doesn't mean that as I stood on the bank of the Cannonball River that I wasn't afraid. But it meant that we're called to be there on the bank of the river, in front of the line, praying and loving by the God who loves us all. In Christ's name.
Amen.